Nathaniel Cross walked into the Suffolk County Family Court building with his mistress on one arm and a petition for temporary custody in his other hand. Vivian Marsh smiled at my daughter the way a woman smiles at a house she has already picked wallpaper for. I held Nora higher against my chest, pressed my palm flat against her back, and let them believe I had come to this building alone. I hadn't. I had come with 12 months of receipts, a nurse who remembered every lie he told her, a forensic accountant who had followed the money into 3 shell accounts, and a lawyer who had told me, 3 days earlier, in a tone flat enough to survive a hurricane, "Let them think you have nothing. People are careless with an audience they've already dismissed." The corridor was too bright for what it was about to hold. Fluorescent panels, polished stone floors that squeaked under dress shoes. A hallway built for people who wanted to look like they belonged in it. Nathaniel was wearing the charcoal suit I had bought him for our 3rd anniversary, the one he used to say made him look like a man other men wanted to do business with. Vivian wore cream. Soft, expensive, deliberately bridal in a way no custody hearing called for. Her hair was swept over one shoulder. A ring on her right hand. Not an engagement ring, not yet, but close enough to matter, caught the light every time she touched his sleeve. They looked like a couple posing for an engagement shoot outside a courthouse that happened, coincidentally, to be deciding the fate of the baby I was holding. Nora stirred against my collarbone, one small fist pressing into the fabric of my coat. Vivian's eyes dropped to her. "Oh," she said, in a voice pitched for sweetness and landing somewhere closer to syrup gone rancid. "She looks worn out. Poor thing. Court is no place for an infant." I looked at Nathaniel. "Then you should have withdrawn the petition." His jaw worked, but Vivian only laughed, soft and satisfied. The laugh of a woman who believes she has already won and is simply waiting for the paperwork to agree with her. "She'll have a quieter life soon," she said. She meant once it was settled. Once she had taken the rest of it. My daughter. My home. My marriage. My last name. My postpartum body. My sleepless nights. My savings account. My grief. They had reduced all of it to a stack of filings and expected me to sign wherever the tabs told me to. Nathaniel stepped closer, dropping his voice to the register he used to use when he wanted a room to think I was the unreasonable one. "Reagan, don't make this uglier than it needs to be. You know you can't do this alone." I looked past his shoulder at the courtroom doors. Alone. He had built his entire case on that word. No family, he'd told his lawyer. No stable income. No emotional control. No steady future to offer a child. He had forgotten, or never noticed, that I had spent the last year learning the difference between being abandoned and being alone. The first was something he did to me. The second was something I had stopped being months ago, quietly, on my own schedule, without asking his permission. My phone buzzed once in my coat pocket. "Diane, we're ready when you are." I didn't smile. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind him, standing there in a hallway lined with strangers' private disasters, of the nights he hadn't come home, the hospital intake forms he never signed, the studio apartment in the Back Bay he was quietly paying for while I was counting formula scoops with one hand and holding a fussing newborn with the other. I looked down at Nora, kissed the warm crown of her head, and walked past both of them toward the courtroom doors. Behind me, I heard Vivian whisper, "Did she really come by herself?" I didn't turn around to answer her. I didn't need to. No. I came prepared. The first thing I noticed about Vivian Marsh that morning wasn't the dress, or the shine in her hair, or the careful, photographed way she held Nathaniel's arm as though she had rehearsed the angle in a mirror. It was her lipstick. A particular shade of rust red I had found once on the rim of a wine glass in my own kitchen, 7 months pregnant, doing the dishes Nathaniel had left for me because he'd had a long day. That night he had called me paranoid. I was 31 weeks along. My ankles were so swollen I had to lower myself to the floor in stages to reach anything under the sink. And there, wedged behind the drain trap where I'd dropped a spoon, was a second wine glass with a stain of that exact color along its rim. When I came home early from a prenatal appointment 2 days later, there had been 2 plates drying in the rack. One fork with a faint pink smear on the tines, and the ghost of perfume in the hallway that wasn't mine and wasn't the housekeeper's. Nathaniel had laughed when I brought it up. "You're just tired," he'd said, tapping my temple like I was a machine that had glitched. "Pregnancy brain. You're seeing things." That morning in court, Vivian wore the same shade, as if she wanted me to remember it. I did. I remembered everything. That has always been my curse, and, eventually, my weapon. The courthouse smelled like floor cleaner, burnt coffee, and the particular nervous sweat of people whose entire futures were about to be decided by strangers in robes. Parents sat on hard benches clutching folders like life rafts. Lawyers murmured near the metal detectors. A little boy in a dinosaur hoodie kicked his sneakers against the leg of his chair, while his mother stared at a spot on the wall, like she was holding herself together with a single visible thread. I stood at the end of the hall with Nora asleep against me, wrapped in a pale yellow blanket I'd bought at the hospital gift shop the week she was born, because Nathaniel had forgotten the hospital bag I'd packed weeks in advance. Her cheek rested against my sweater. Every breath she took was small and damp and entirely real, and she had no idea that 3 adults were about to sit in front of a judge and argue over who got to keep her. My lawyer, Diane Marsh, no relation to Vivian, a coincidence Diane found more amusing than I did, wasn't there yet. She'd gone to file supplemental evidence, the last pieces we'd gathered less than 12 hours earlier. I'd told her I could wait by myself. I wasn't afraid of waiting. I had waited through unanswered rings while I was in labor. I had waited on nights when Nathaniel claimed late meetings and came home carrying Vivian's perfume on his collar like a souvenir. I had waited for him to become a father after Nora arrived, and waiting had taught me exactly one lesson. People show you who they are the moment they believe you have no other option. Nathaniel walked in at 8:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my phone the second the air in the hallway changed. His presence used to do that to me. Thicken a room, tighten my shoulders, rearrange my thoughts around whatever mood he'd walked in wearing. If he was tired, I went quiet. If he was irritated, I went careful. If he was charming, I was grateful. Pathetically, embarrassingly grateful, for scraps I would never have accepted from a stranger. Now I just noted the time. He went through security first, holding his phone out to the bailiff with the mild, impatient confidence of a man who has never once believed a rule was meant to slow him down. Vivian followed, stepping so lightly it was as though the courthouse floor were beneath her personally, though she clearly enjoyed having an audience for it. Nathaniel's lawyer, Gregory Voss, trailed behind them with a leather briefcase and the particular expression of a man who bills $300 an hour and genuinely enjoys the moment his opposing party realizes they can't afford him. Nathaniel saw me and stopped. For exactly 1 second I watched something cross his face. Surprise, maybe discomfort, maybe even the faint residue of guilt. Then Vivian looped her hand through his elbow and it vanished. He straightened his shoulders like a man correcting posture in a mirror. "Reagan," he said. Vivian leaned forward, eyes widening theatrically at the sight of Nora. "She's so tiny." I turned Nora away a half-second before Vivian's fingers could reach the blanket. Her smile tightened. "I was just being friendly." "You were reaching for my daughter without asking." The woman on the bench beside us looked up. Nathaniel's nostrils flared. "Here we go. I haven't even started anything yet." Vivian lifted a glossy shopping bag. "We brought something for her. A cashmere blanket. Softer than that one." I looked at the bag, then at her. She doesn't need anything from you. Reagan. Nathaniel dropped into the tone he used when he wanted a room to see me as difficult. This is what I'm talking about. What are you talking about? The hostility, the instability, the refusal of basic courtesy. Vivian's smile returned, small and rehearsed. I know this is hard for you, but we all have to think of what's best for Nora. We. The word was quiet, which made it land harder. Vivian is part of my life now, Nathaniel said. She was part of your life while I was still pregnant. Something shifted in his face. Not enough for a stranger to catch, but enough for me. He hadn't expected me to say that out loud, in a public hallway, in front of his lawyer. Gregory Voss stepped in smoothly. Mrs. Cross, I'd advise against inflammatory accusations inside a courthouse. It's Miss Ashford now, I said. I filed the paperwork last week. Nathaniel's gaze snapped to mine. It was the first crack of the morning, and it was mine. Vivian recovered faster than he did. Last names don't matter. What matters is a stable environment for the baby. I almost laughed. Apparently, stability meant showing up to family court with your husband's mistress and attempting to pry an infant away from the mother who had slept beside her crib every single night since she was born. But I had promised Diane I would give them nothing they could quote out of context, so I adjusted Nora's hat instead of answering. Nathaniel's eyes dropped to my diaper bag. Gray canvas. Unremarkable. Entirely practical. One side pocket held a bottle. The other held folded medical records, printed vaccination charts, and a flash drive sealed in a plastic evidence bag. He saw none of it. He saw a tired woman holding a baby. You really came alone, he said, and there was something almost gentle in it. The particular gentleness of a man who has already decided he's about to win. Did I? His mouth curved into something close to pity. Please don't make a scene. I know your father hasn't spoken to you in years. Your friends have distanced themselves. You quit your job. You don't have the support system this requires. For a second, the hallway blurred into another one. A different night. Nathaniel standing over me while I sat on the nursery floor surrounded by unopened boxes of diapers I'd assembled alone. You can't think straight right now, he'd told me then. You need me. I had believed him, because when you are exhausted enough, a cage can be mistaken for shelter. Now I only heard the strategy underneath it. No support. No money. No emotional stability. No chance. Vivian leaned in, lowering her voice to something conspiratorial. You don't have to lose everything today. Nathaniel is still willing to be generous. Generous with what? The marital funds he used to cover your rent? Nathaniel's jaw hardened. Careful. The word dropped between us like something he'd used before, because he had. Careful. The first time I asked why his phone suddenly had a passcode. Careful, when I questioned a hotel receipt from a business trip he swore he hadn't taken. Careful when I cried after he missed Nora's first pediatrician appointment and told me I was making fatherhood exhausting for him. Careful had always meant stop before I punish you for noticing. Today, it meant nothing at all. Behind me, heels clicked against the polished floor. Reagan, Diane said, her voice level as still water. She wore a dark navy suit and the kind of posture that made loud men instinctively lower their voices. She didn't look at Nathaniel first. She looked at Nora, then at me. Everything's filed. Good, I said. Gregory Voss smiled. Diane, always with the last-minute filing theatrics. Only when the other side withholds material facts, Diane said pleasantly. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. What facts? You'll hear them when the judge does. Vivian let out a light, too breezy laugh. This seems so unnecessary. We're all adults here. Diane finally turned to her. Ms. Marsh, you are not a party to this custody matter. Color rose under Vivian's makeup. Nathaniel stepped in. She's here as my support, and potentially as a character witness. In that case, Diane said, I'd recommend she be careful. There was that word again. This time it pointed the other way, and it landed harder than anything I'd said. A clerk called our case, Cross versus Ashford, petition for temporary residence and visitation of the minor child. Hearing my own name separated from his, unfamiliar and clean, felt like something surgical. Nathaniel moved first, guiding Vivian toward the door. Before she stepped through it, she looked back over her shoulder. Nora deserves a whole family. I looked down at my daughter's sleeping face. She had one. Your side broke it. Then I walked into the courtroom. Inside, the air was cooler. Wooden benches faced forward in orderly rows. The judge's bench loomed beneath the state seal, flanked by flags that had seen better decades. This room did not care about my broken heart, and that was exactly why I trusted it more than I had ever trusted Nathaniel's apologies. It didn't need to love me. It needed proof. I sat at the respondents' table beside Diane. Nathaniel and Gregory Voss sat opposite us. Vivian took a seat directly behind Nathaniel, crossing her legs and arranging her cream-colored dress over her knees with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed being looked at. She wanted to be seen. I wanted the truth to be seen. Those are not the same ambition, and only one of them holds up under cross-examination. The judge entered. We rose. Nora stirred against me, and I pressed my lips to her temple to keep her quiet. Good morning, said Judge Eleanor Faircloth. She was in her late 50s, silver hair pulled back into a low knot, reading glasses perched at the end of her nose like an afterthought she'd stopped fighting years ago. We're here on the petition of Mr. Cross for temporary primary residence of the minor child, Nora Elizabeth Cross, age 4 months. Hearing Nora's full name in that voice made something in my stomach clench. At the hospital, Nathaniel had insisted on his own last name for her, even though he'd missed the first 19 hours of her life. It's tradition, he'd said, and I had been too stitched up and exhausted to argue. Not today. Judge Faircloth looked over both tables. I understand emotions are high in matters like this. I expect restraint, relevance, and honesty from everyone in this room. Nathaniel glanced at me when she said restraint. I kept my eyes on the judge. Mr. Voss, you may begin. Gregory Voss rose, buttoning his jacket with the unhurried confidence of a man who has done this hundreds of times and lost only when he chose to. Your Honor, my client is a successful, stable, financially secure father who is deeply concerned for the well-being of his infant daughter. Since the separation, Ms. Ashford has demonstrated erratic behavior, financial instability, and an unwillingness to co-parent in good faith. We intend to show that Mr. Cross can provide a safer, calmer, more structured environment for this child. He let the words hang. Safer, calmer, structured. Behind him, Vivian leaned forward slightly, her lipstick bright under the fluorescent panels. My daughter slept in my arms, unaware that 3 adults in expensive clothing were trying to frame motherhood as a quarterly performance review. This is not an attempt to punish Ms. Ashford, Voss continued. It is an attempt to protect Nora. I watched Diane write a single word on her legal pad. Protect. She underlined it once. Unhurried. The way you underline something you intend to come back for later. Nathaniel looked at me across the aisle, and his expression said what his lawyer hadn't. You should have just settled. I held Nora a little closer. No, Nathaniel. You should have remembered who keeps the receipts. Voss laid out the rest of his client's case the way a realtor stages a house for sale. Everything unflattering tucked out of sight beneath a fresh coat of paint. He talked about Nathaniel's income first because men like Nathaniel believe money becomes a personality trait once it clears a certain number. He described the house in Brookline, its fenced yard, the freshly painted nursery, the security system, The proximity to top-rated schools, as though Nora were enrolling in a kindergarten admissions process rather than learning, 4 months into her life, how to hold her own head up. He did not mention that the nursery had sat empty for 3 weeks after I moved out. He did not mention that I was the one who had bought the crib, washed the tiny sheets twice before use, folded the newborn clothes by size, and knelt on the floor at midnight assembling a mobile while Nathaniel drank champagne with Vivian in a hotel bar 11 blocks away. He showed the judge photographs: a sun-washed living room, a white crib, a changing table stocked with diapers still in their plastic wrap, a shelf of board books that had never once been opened. The photos were beautiful. I recognized the staging immediately, because I recognized the plush elephant hanging from the crib rail. The store tag was still attached, dangling in 3 of the 4 images. Mr. Cross has prepared a safe and welcoming environment for his daughter, Voss said. Diane made another note. Staged. Then came the part I had been bracing for since Diane first warned me it was coming. Voss projected screenshots of text messages I had sent Nathaniel during the first month after Nora was born. I can't do this alone anymore. Please pick up. She has a fever and I'm scared. I haven't slept in 2 days. I need help. He read them aloud in a tone engineered to make fear sound like instability. Your Honor, these messages demonstrate a consistent pattern of Ms. Ashford being overwhelmed and emotionally volatile. My fingers tightened on the edge of Nora's blanket. I remembered sending the message about the fever at 2:14 in the morning. Her skin had been burning under my palm. Her breathing had come fast and shallow. Her small body had curled tight against my chest in obvious discomfort. I had called Nathaniel 7 times. He hadn't answered. Diane would show the room exactly where he'd been that night, but not yet. Courts have a rhythm, she'd told me. Let them overplay their hand. People who lie enough eventually trap themselves in their own timeline, so I sat still. Voss clicked a remote and a video filled a screen mounted near the judge's bench. My own living room, a corner of the couch, my face pale and swollen with exhaustion. Nora crying in my arms. I was crying too, silently, my hair a wreck, my eyes hollow. I looked devastated because I had been devastated. I looked frightened because I had been frightened. I knew this video. Nathaniel had filmed it without telling me, coming in after midnight while I was trying to soothe Nora through a stretch of colic that had lasted 3 hours. I had asked him to hold her for 10 minutes so I could shower. Instead, he had stood in the doorway, angling his phone. You need to see yourself, he'd said. In the video, my voice cracked. Please stop recording and just help me. Voss requested a 15-minute recess before his cross-examination of my character, and Judge Faircloth granted it. Diane walked me to a small side room reserved for parties who needed water, a moment, or both. I sat with Nora asleep on my shoulder and let my mind do the thing it always did in quiet rooms. It went backward. I met Nathaniel Cross at a fundraising gala for a children's hospital in Boston, in a ballroom lit gold, 3 years before Nora existed even as an idea. He wore navy and had a laugh that made strangers turn toward him without meaning to. I was 26, 3 years out of business school, working long hours at a mid-sized investment firm and telling myself I liked the hours because they proved something. My father, Walter Ashford, had built a modest but respected engineering firm from nothing, and I had spent my whole life trying to prove I could build something of my own without his name attached to it. Nathaniel found that admirable, he said. He told me I was the most self-sufficient woman he'd ever dated. He said it so often in the first year that I mistook repetition for depth. The isolation didn't arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrived the way water gets into a foundation. Slowly, through hairline cracks you don't notice until the basement floods. It started with small comments about my father. He's a little controlling, don't you think? He wants to run your life the way he runs that company. Then comments about my friends. Doesn't Priya only call when she needs something? I've noticed that. Then comments about my job. You work so hard for a firm that doesn't even know your name. Imagine what you could build if you weren't spread so thin. Each comment, alone, sounded like concern. Together, over 2 years, they became a fence, and I was the one who kept building it, plank by plank, believing I was building a marriage instead. The rupture with my father happened at my wedding rehearsal dinner, of all places. My father raised a toast that was warmer than expected from a man not known for public warmth, and somewhere in it, he said gently that he hoped Nathaniel would always let me keep my own name in every sense of the word, not just on paper. Nathaniel laughed it off in the room. In the car afterward, he was quiet in the particular way that meant a storm was loading itself for later. That night, in the honeymoon suite 2 days after the wedding, he told me my father had insulted him in front of 40 guests. I apologized for a comment I hadn't made. I called my father the next morning and told him he'd embarrassed me. I still remember the long pause on the line before he said quietly, "All right, Reagan, I hear you." I didn't hear what was underneath his voice that day. I hear it now, replaying it in memory the way you replay a song once you finally understand the lyrics. It was grief, arriving early, for a daughter he could already see disappearing. By the time Nora was conceived, the distance between me and my father had calcified into something that felt, at the time, like my own decision. I told myself I was protecting my marriage. I told myself Nathaniel was simply protective of me. I told myself a great many things in those years, in the particular voice people use when they are narrating their own captivity as a love story. Nathaniel found me crying in the honeymoon suite once, over something small, a canceled reservation, I think, though the memory has worn soft at the edges, and said exactly what I wanted to hear. He's controlling. I'm your family now. I believed him. That is how the isolation came fully into my life, not through locked doors, through comforting words, spoken by someone who benefited from every single bridge I helped him burn. By the time Nora was born, the bridge back to my father felt too long to cross in one trip, and I had stopped believing I deserved to try. Labor started during a thunderstorm in early spring. I woke at 3:20 in the morning to a deep ache low in my back, and the strange, sudden certainty that my life had just split cleanly into a before and an after. Nathaniel wasn't home. He'd said he had a late dinner with investors from a fund he was courting. I called him once from the bathroom floor, gripping the edge of the tub through a contraction. No answer. I called again, timing the next one against the microwave clock in the kitchen. No answer. By the fourth call, my hands were shaking too hard to hold the phone steady, and I gave up and called a car service instead. The driver, a woman named Marisol, kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror the whole way to the hospital. "You in labor, sweetie? You want me to call somebody for you?" "I already did," I told her. It wasn't really an answer, but she let it be one, the way kind strangers sometimes do when they sense that pushing further would only make things worse. At the hospital, a nurse named Rosa helped me into a gown and asked, gently, where my support person was. "He's on his way," I lied. Rosa didn't challenge it. She had the kind of eyes that had clearly seen too many versions of that particular lie to demand an explanation on the spot. Nurses learn, I think, when a question would only add cruelty to a room that already has enough of it. Nora was born 18 hours later, after a labor that stalled twice and required an intervention I will not describe in detail, because some things belong only to the body that survived them. Nathaniel arrived 21 hours after I'd first called him. By then I was holding my daughter against my bare chest, skin to skin the way the nurses had shown me, whispering, "It's just you and me," long before I understood how completely true those 5 words would turn out to be. He walked in with damp hair, a fresh shirt, and a cheap mixed bouquet from the lobby kiosk. Not the peonies I loved, just whatever had been closest to the register. "I got here as soon as I could," he said. Rosa was checking Nora's vitals at the time. Her expression didn't change, but her hand paused for half a second over the chart. I noticed. Nathaniel noticed too, and something tightened briefly at the corner of his jaw before he smoothed it away and kissed my forehead, right in front of her. "You did so good." I wanted so badly to believe him that, for about an hour, I did. Then his phone lit up on the rolling table beside my hospital bed while he was in the bathroom. I wasn't trying to see it. It simply lit the dim room like a small flare. "Vivian. Did she have the baby yet? I hate sleeping alone." I stared at the screen until it went dark on its own. When Nathaniel came out, I asked carefully, "Who's Vivian?" He looked at the phone, then at me, then at Nora sleeping in the bassinet between us. "You're going through my phone while our daughter is sleeping right next to you?" That was how he always did it. He took the knife I'd just found and somehow put the handle back in my hand, so that by the time we left the hospital 2 days later I had apologized. Not because I believed I was wrong, but because I was bleeding and stitched and terrified, holding a newborn in a car seat while Nathaniel drove too fast and refused to speak. The weeks that followed blurred into a smear of milk stains, physical pain, and the fluorescent light of the kitchen at hours that shouldn't exist. Nathaniel started sleeping in the guest room, for work. "I need my rest," he said, as if Nora's 2-hour feeding schedule were a personal inconvenience he had opted out of, rather than a fact of biology neither of us had chosen alone. Sometimes I would stand in the hallway with Nora in my arms and watch him leave for the office, suit pressed, watch gleaming, expression annoyed if she happened to be crying too loudly for his taste. "You need to get that under control," he said once. "She's a newborn, Nathaniel." "Other women manage." I never asked which women he meant. Some part of me already suspected I didn't want the answer yet. The money started looking suspicious before I ever caught him with another woman in the room. Not that it was vanishing outright. Nathaniel was too careful for anything that obvious. Transfers began moving out of our joint account into categories I didn't recognize: consulting fees, event support, lease advances, client entertainment. I had managed household budgets long before Nora existed. I knew how people hid spending when they believed the person reading the statements was too exhausted to do the math. One night at 4:08 in the morning, after Nathaniel had failed to answer any of my calls during a fever scare, I opened my laptop while Nora slept in short, restless bursts against my chest. The apartment was dark except for the glow of the screen. I downloaded 3 months of bank statements, then 6, then 12. I created a folder titled Nora. Inside it, I created a second folder titled Evidence. My hand shook as I typed the name, not out of guilt, but because naming the folder meant naming what my marriage actually was. I saved everything after that: bank statements, text threads, photographs, pediatrician appointment records, screenshots of missed calls, time-stamped, emails from Nathaniel excusing himself from appointments he'd promised to attend, hotel bar receipts from nights he claimed to be working, footage from our video doorbell. His idea, originally, for security, showing Vivian entering our building on afternoons I was at postpartum checkups. He had forgotten I still had the login. The night I stopped making excuses for him wasn't the night I found the worst piece of evidence. It was quieter than that. Nora was 5 weeks old. I was sitting on the nursery floor trying to fold onesies one-handed while holding her with the other arm. Nathaniel came home at 12:34 in the morning. Vivian's perfume arrived in the room before he did. I looked up. "I need you to be honest with me." He sighed like I'd asked him to relocate a mountain. "Not tonight." "Yes, tonight." He loosened his tie. "You're obsessed." "I know about the hotel." His gaze sharpened. I know about the rent payments, the jewelry, the restaurants, the texts. For a moment he looked almost relieved. Not guilty. Relieved. The way a man looks when the rules of a game he's tired of playing have finally changed in his favor. Fine, he said. You want honesty? You're not the woman I married anymore. I looked down at Nora. I had a baby. You've become bitter, he said. Suspicious. Needy. Vivian understands me. There it was. The name. No longer a shadow in a phone screen, but a full person, standing in the room with us whether she was physically present or not. I expected the sentence to break something in me. Instead, I went very still. Nathaniel mistook the stillness for weakness. I think we need to discuss a separation, he said. And custody. I'm not going to let you use Nora to punish me. I laughed once. A strange, dry, almost peaceful sound. You've been gone for most of her life. She's 5 weeks old. Exactly. He stepped closer. Careful, Reagan. If this gets ugly, you won't win. You don't have the money. You don't have your father. You don't have anyone who can stand up in that courtroom and say you're stable. There it was. The plan, spoken a few months too early. I held his gaze for a long moment, then picked up my phone. What are you doing? He asked, lip curling. Taking notes. For what? For the future. He laughed and walked away toward the guest room. I sat on the nursery floor until dawn, Nora sleeping on my chest, and wrote down every word he'd said while it was still fresh enough to be exact. At 7 that morning, I opened my contacts. My father's number was still there, unchanged in 3 years, as if some part of me had always known I'd need it again. I didn't call him. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, I stopped pushing the thought away. Vivian asked to meet at a coffee shop in the South End with marble tables, glass light fixtures, and pastries arranged like jewelry in a case. It was the kind of place where women ordered oat milk lattes, and men in expensive coats pretended not to check each other's watches. I arrived 5 minutes early because Nora had just fallen asleep in her stroller, and I had learned, over 5 months, to treat infant sleep the way you treat weather. You move while the sky allows it. Vivian was already there, of course. She sat by the window in a camel coat with gold buttons, stirring a cappuccino she never once drank, and arranged her face into a careful, camera-ready smile when she saw me. Thanks for coming, she said. I came because you said it was about Nora. It is. I parked the stroller beside my chair and sat without removing my coat. Nora slept under the canopy, one small socked foot the only visible part of her. Vivian glanced at the foot and sighed. She really is beautiful. I didn't answer. The old version of me would have filled that silence, tried to seem polite, reasonable, above pettiness. She would have hated herself for caring what Vivian thought of her, and cared anyway. That version of me was exhausted. The current version had a phone in her coat pocket with the voice recorder already running. Vivian lowered her voice. I know you hate me. I don't know you well enough to hate you. That annoyed her more than an insult would have. Fine, I understand why you're angry. But Nathaniel and I didn't plan this. You didn't plan to sleep with a married man while his wife was pregnant? Her gaze flicked to the next table, where a man typing on a laptop didn't look up, though his fingers paused mid-sentence. Vivian leaned forward. Relationships are complicated. Infidelity usually isn't. Her smile thinned. Okay. If you want to be sharp, let's be sharp. Nathaniel was lonely. Lonely. You pushed him away. You were pregnant. You became obsessed with the baby. I almost admired the cruelty of it, almost. Nora made a small noise in her stroller and I bent to adjust her blanket. Vivian watched the movement. That's what I mean, she said softly. You disappear into being a mother. and Nathaniel needs a partner. Someone who sees him. You saw him so clearly you missed the wedding ring. Color rose in her cheeks. Nathaniel told me your marriage was already over. It wasn't over when he was in your bed. Her lips parted, then closed. I let the silence sit between us until she chose a different angle. I didn't ask you here to fight. Then what for? Because court is going to be painful for everyone. I think it would be better if you accepted reality now. Which reality is that? That Nathaniel can give Nora more. There it was. The actual reason, laid bare. Not love. Not care. More. More money. More house. More image. More beautiful family photographs where Vivian could stand in white holding a baby she hadn't carried for 9 months and nearly died delivering. I leaned back. More of what? A stable home, she said. A father who can provide. And a mother figure who isn't drowning. The words were rehearsed. I could almost hear Gregory Voss's voice underneath them. A mother figure, I repeated. Her hand tightened around her spoon. You know what I mean. I want to hear it from you. I nodded toward the stroller. Nora's asleep. Speak freely. It worked. Vanity overrode her caution. I mean someone who can help raise her without turning every day into a crisis. Someone calm, presentable. Someone who isn't sobbing on the floor holding an infant. My pulse jumped, but I kept my face still. Nathaniel showed you that video. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. He was worried. He was filming me instead of helping me. He didn't know what else to do. He could have taken the baby for 10 minutes. She looked away. She knew. Of course she knew. Women like Vivian always know exactly who men like Nathaniel are. They simply believe the cruelty will always be aimed at someone else. Forever. On principle. She picked up her cup. Look, I'm not trying to replace you. No. But Nora will be spending time with Nathaniel and I'll be there. It would be healthier if you stopped treating me like some temporary inconvenience. I could feel the small red recording light through the fabric of my coat pocket, as if it were giving off actual heat. How long have you been staying at Nathaniel's place? I asked. Her gaze sharpened. Why do you ask? Curiosity. That's between me and Nathaniel. It was between you and Nathaniel while I still lived there. She held my gaze a long moment, then smiled. You really want to know? I was there more than you think. My stomach tightened, but I didn't move. While you were at doctor's appointments, sometimes while you were in the hospital. Don't be dramatic. There was that exact phrase again, handed down from Nathaniel to his mother to Vivian, like a family heirloom nobody had thought to appraise. You and Nathaniel were already broken, Vivian continued. I just gave him a place to breathe. No. He gave you our money, our time, and my place in his life while I was carrying his child. She gave a delicate shrug. And now he wants to protect Nora from all that bitterness. All that bitterness meant me, meant my failure to simply accept it and disappear quietly. A waitress approached with a polite smile, sensed the temperature of the table, and retreated without asking if we needed anything. Vivian lowered her voice. I'll be honest with you. Nathaniel is going to win. Maybe not everything, but enough. He has the house. He has the income. He has his mother. He has people who will testify that you're unstable. People? She paused. The pause was significant. What people, Vivian? She caught herself. I'm not here to discuss strategy. You brought up court. I'm asking about reality. Have you and Nathaniel discussed how to make me look unstable? Her face closed like a door. Be careful, she said, and it sounded much weaker coming from her than it ever had from him. She stood, adjusting her coat. I had hoped we could be adults about this. You had hoped I'd be scared. She picked up her bag. You should be. Then she leaned toward the stroller. Not close enough to touch Nora, but close enough that I was on my feet before I'd decided to be, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Vivian smiled. See? That's what I mean. I took the phone out of my pocket and stopped the recording. Her gaze dropped to the screen for the first time since she'd sat down. Uncertainty entered her expression. You were recording me. We're in a public place, I said, and you asked to discuss my child's custody arrangement. You can't use that. Maybe not, but my lawyer can listen to it. Her hand tightened on her purse strap. She'll wonder why Nathaniel's girlfriend is discussing mother figures, court strategy, and how to make the actual mother look unstable. I didn't say strategy. You said enough. I walked out before she could answer. Outside, the afternoon air was sharp and clean. Nora woke as I pushed the stroller down the block, her small cries rising into the cold. I stopped by a pharmacy window and lifted her into my arms. I know, I whispered. I know. My phone buzzed. An unknown sender. A single photograph. Nathaniel and Vivian entering the Carlisle-adjacent hotel downtown. The timestamp read 1:04 a.m. on the night Nora had run a fever of 102. Beneath the photo, one line. Thought you could use this? I stood on the sidewalk holding my daughter and stared at the screen while traffic moved around me, indifferent. For months, Nathaniel had counted on the darkness protecting him. Now even strangers were handing me the light, one photograph at a time, as though the truth itself had finally decided whose side it was on. My father lived behind black iron gates I had hated as a teenager and, somewhere in my 20s, started to hate for entirely different reasons. In my youth, the gates had felt like protection. By the time I married Nathaniel, they had started to feel like a sentence. Proof, in my own head, that I came from a family too controlling to understand real love when it finally arrived. I understand now how thoroughly that idea had been planted, and by whom, and why it had taken root so easily in soil that was, admittedly, already a little tired of proving itself. Walter Ashford's house sat at the end of a long driveway lined with old maples and neatly trimmed hedges. It wasn't flashy. My father had never been a man for show. It was a solid, symmetrical house built of gray stone and old money, the kind of house people call tasteful when what they actually mean is impossible to ignore, even from the road. I parked at the bottom of the front steps and cut the engine. Nora was asleep in her car seat behind me. For 5 full minutes, I didn't move. I had faced Vivian. I had faced Nathaniel at his worst. I was about to face a courtroom full of strangers who would debate, in professional tones, my fitness to raise my own daughter. But the simple act of ringing my father's doorbell made my palms sweat in a way none of that had. Maybe it was because I had once thrown his love back in his face and called it control. Maybe it was because I was afraid he would look at me and see, laid bare, every mistake I had defended for 3 straight years. Or maybe it was because some small, stubborn part of me still heard Nathaniel's voice in my head. Your father doesn't want you back. He wants to say, I told you so. I looked at Nora in the rearview mirror. Her mouth was slightly open in sleep, a tiny crease forming and disappearing between her brows the way it always did right before she woke up hungry. I got out of the car. The front door opened before I reached it. My father stood on the threshold in a charcoal sweater and dark trousers, older than I remembered and yet, somehow, exactly the same. The lines around his eyes deeper, the hair at his temples almost entirely silver now. His face, always serious, changed the instant he saw the car seat in my hand. Reagan, he said. I stopped on the bottom step. Hi, Dad. For a second, neither of us moved. Then Nora made a small sound against my shoulder, and something in his expression cracked open in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child running to him after a nightmare. May I? He started, then stopped himself. Unsure. for the first time in my memory, of what he was allowed to ask. "Her name is Nora," I said. "Nora Elizabeth." He came down the last step slowly, the way you approach something you're afraid might vanish if you move too fast. I shifted her gently into his arms. He held her the way engineers hold things, carefully, with both hands fully committed, as if structural failure were a genuine possibility he intended to prevent through sheer attentiveness. Nora blinked up at him, unimpressed, and he laughed, a short, surprised sound I hadn't heard from him in 3 years. "She has your mother's chin," he said quietly. We stood there for a long moment, the three of us, on the steps of a house I had spent years insisting I no longer needed. Then he looked up at me, and his eyes were wet in a way he clearly hadn't planned for. "I'm sorry," I said, before he could say anything at all. "For everything I said. For believing the version of you he built for me." My father shook his head slowly. "You don't apologize to me for surviving something I couldn't see clearly enough to stop." He looked back down at Nora. "I should have pushed harder. I let you push me away because I thought fighting for you would only prove him right." "You couldn't have known." "I suspected," he said, quiet and honest in a way that cost him something visible. "I just didn't know how to say it without losing you entirely. So I said nothing, and I lost time with you instead. I've had 3 years to sit with that particular regret." He led us inside. The house smelled the way it always had. Cedar, old books, coffee brewing somewhere deep in the kitchen. He set up a corner of the study for Nora almost immediately, moving a bassinet in from storage that I hadn't even known he still owned, a relic from some cousin's baby shower a decade earlier that he'd apparently kept just in case. That first night after Nora was finally asleep, my father poured 2 glasses of wine and set one in front of me at the kitchen table without asking if I wanted it. The way he used to when I was in college and clearly needed one whether I said so or not. "Tell me everything," he said. "Not the version you've been telling yourself to survive it. The real one." So I did. It took 3 hours. He didn't interrupt, except to refill my glass and, once, to leave the room for exactly 90 seconds. Long enough, I realized later, to compose himself somewhere I couldn't see it happen. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, turning his own glass slowly on the table. "You're not doing this alone," he finally said. "Not the custody case. Not any of it. I don't care what it costs, and I don't care how long it takes. Dad, I don't want you to fight my battles for me. I'm not fighting them for you," he said. "I'm making sure you have everything you need to fight them yourself. There's a difference, and I intend to respect it, even if it kills me not to intervene directly at least once." I laughed despite myself, and it was the first time in over a year that laughing hadn't felt like something I owed someone else's permission for. Diane Marsh's office occupied the 9th floor of a building on State Street. All glass walls and quiet efficiency, the kind of place where nothing on the desk was ever out of alignment by accident. My father had found her through an old business associate whose own divorce, he assured me, had been considerably uglier than mine looked on paper. "She doesn't lose custody cases," he'd said. "She loses patience with people who waste her time. Don't waste her time." I didn't. In our first meeting, I brought the flash drive, 3 months of printed bank statements, and a folder of screenshots I'd organized by date without anyone asking me to. Diane looked through it for 11 minutes without speaking, and then looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "Most clients bring me feelings," she said. "You brought me a timeline. I had a lot of sleepless nights to fill." "Good. We're going to fill several more of them, but productively this time." We hired a forensic accountant named Priyanka Osei, a woman with a soft voice and a spreadsheet brain who could apparently smell a Shell LLC from across a room. It took her 6 weeks to trace the transfers Nathaniel had labeled consulting fees and event support back to 2 accounts registered under names that traced eventually to Vivian's cousin and, in one case, to Vivian herself. Over 14 months, more than $90,000 of marital funds had moved quietly into rent payments, jewelry, and a leased car that Vivian drove but never once had to make a payment on. He was careful, Priyanka told us during one meeting, sliding a printout across the table. But careful isn't the same as clean. People who think they're clever leave a trail that's actually easier to follow than the ones who don't bother trying to hide anything at all. Diane and I spent whole afternoons matching receipts to dates. We matched a hotel charge to the exact night Nora had spiked her fever. We matched a jewelry purchase to a photograph Vivian had posted, then quietly deleted on social media. We matched Nathaniel's claims of working late to credit card charges in neighborhoods where none of his actual clients lived or worked. We matched his missed visitation confirmations to calendar invitations with Vivian's name on them, sent from his own assistant's account. Every lie, it turned out, had a date attached to it. Every betrayal had left a receipt somewhere. Every attempt to frame me as unstable now had context that flipped the frame entirely. "Stay with the numbers," Diane told me once, when my hands had curled into fists under the conference table without my noticing. Anger is useful. It's just useful in the way gasoline is useful, only if you keep it in the tank instead of pouring it over everything you touch. Then came the settlement offer. Nathaniel sent it through Gregory Voss with a cover note about wanting to avoid unnecessary conflict for everyone's sake. The proposed agreement offered limited child support and joint legal custody in name only. Physical custody would shift heavily toward Nathaniel once Nora turned 6 months old. It included a morality clause that applied to me and, curiously, not to him. It restricted my ability to relocate for work. It allowed Nathaniel to appoint trusted individuals for childcare during his custodial time, a clause that named no one directly, but obviously meant Vivian. Buried on page 11 was a non-disclosure agreement. I read that clause twice. He wants me silent. More than he wants peace, Diane said, nodding. If I sign this, she gets my daughter half the time before Nora can even sit up unassisted. I flipped to the holidays schedule attached in the appendix. My first Mother's Day as an actual mother was listed, in plain black type, as Nathaniel's scheduled weekend. It wasn't an oversight. It was a message, sent through a 15-page legal document because he'd known better than to say it to my face. I closed the folder. "No, we're not taking this." "I know," Diane said. "I just needed you to say it out loud. Once. So it's on record that it was your decision and not mine." My phone rang that afternoon while we were still in her office. Nathaniel's name lit up the screen. Diane glanced at it. "You don't have to answer that." "I want to." She pressed the speaker button and gave me a short nod. All communication was supposed to run through counsel by then, but if he chose to call anyway, she wanted a witness in the room. "Did you restrict the joint account?" he asked, without a greeting, the moment I answered. "Yes." "You had no right." "It's a marital account currently under review in an active custody proceeding." "You sound like your lawyer." "Good." A pause. "I wanted to be fair to you." "You mean the agreement that gives Vivian access to my daughter and gags me from ever discussing it?" "She's part of my family now." "She's your mistress." "She's not going anywhere." "Neither am I." His breathing changed on the line, sharper, tighter. There had been a time when that shift alone would have made me apologize preemptively for whatever I'd apparently done to cause it. Not anymore. "You're making yourself look hostile," he said. "I'm making myself clear." "You don't understand what you're risking." "I do." "No, you don't. Judges care about stability. I have a home, an income, a family. You have postpartum episodes and a grudge." Diane looked up sharply from her legal pad. I kept my voice level. Do you want to discuss Nora's medical appointment schedule? Don't change the subject. It's the only subject we should be discussing directly. Fine, he snapped. Let's discuss Nora. You think it's good for her to watch you fall apart? My stomach clenched, but I heard Diane's pen scratching steadily across her legal pad, and it steadied me. Nora is 5 months old. What's good for her is being fed, kept safe, and cared for by a secure adult. Exactly, which is why I'm doing all of this. Then answer one question. What brand of formula is she on right now? The silence on the line stretched long enough to become its own answer. Don't play games, Reagan. What size diapers does she wear? What's her pediatrician's name? I know her doctor's. He stopped. The name, Nathaniel. He swore under his breath. Diane wrote 3 words on her pad. Unhurried. Father doesn't know. Are you trying to trap me? He demanded. No, I'm asking basic questions about the child you're petitioning for primary custody of. I'm her father. Then start acting like it. The words were out before I'd softened them, and I found, to my mild surprise, that I didn't regret a single syllable. Nathaniel went quiet. Then his voice dropped low. You're going to regret this path. No, I said. I regretted the other one. I hung up. My hand shook a little afterward, but only a little. Diane leaned back in her chair. That was useful. He sounded horrible. He revealed himself. There's a difference, and it's the only one that matters in a courtroom. When I left Diane's office, it had started to rain. I stood under the awning outside the building, juggling Nora's car seat, the diaper bag, and an umbrella I couldn't quite manage to open one-handed. Across the street, a black SUV idled at the curb. I didn't think much of it at first. Cars idle everywhere in that part of the city. Then the passenger window rolled down. Vivian was inside. Nathaniel was driving. She stared at me through the rain without smiling this time. His face stayed in shadow, but I could feel the anger radiating off him from 30 feet away, the way you can sometimes feel a stove is still hot without touching it. My phone buzzed. A text from Gregory Voss. Ms. Ashford, your refusal to cooperate with the proposed agreement will be noted for the court's consideration. I looked from the text to the SUV, then opened my email and forwarded the message to Diane with a single line. Add it to the file. The SUV pulled away a few seconds later. Nora slept through the entire exchange, undisturbed by rain, by threats, by the particular chill of being watched from a car by 2 people who had once shared a private joke about how easily they'd get away with everything. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was being chased. I felt like I was documenting them. One small incident at a time, the way you'd document termite damage before a house sale, quietly, thoroughly, and for the benefit of whoever needed the proof later. The hospital looked different when I returned without a massive belly or a car seat clutched in white-knuckled terror. Brighter somehow. Less intimidating. I walked the halls of the maternity ward holding Nora against my chest and felt my body remember what my mind had tried to file away as simple fact. The smell of antiseptic, the squeak of rubber soles on polished floors, the distant cry of a newborn behind a closed door, the steady, indifferent beep of machinery keeping its own quiet schedule. I had become a mother in this building. Nathaniel had become an absence here, and both of those facts were now, at last, part of an official record somewhere. Diane had arranged a meeting with Rosa, the nurse who'd helped me through labor. I found her at the nurse's station reviewing a chart, and recognition crossed her face before I even spoke. Reagan, she said, and this must be Nora. Nora blinked at her, unimpressed as usual by adults who weren't currently offering food. Rosa smiled. She has your eyes. Thank you for meeting with me. Her expression softened. I wondered if I'd hear from you again. That surprises me. Don't be surprised. I've been on this ward for 18 years. You learn what real support looks like, and you learn what the absence of it looks like, even when someone works very hard to disguise it with flowers from a lobby kiosk. A lump rose in my throat. She led me to a small consultation room at the end of the hall. 2 chairs, a round table, a box of tissues placed with the specific foreboding of a room designed for exactly this kind of conversation. Diane mentioned you might be willing to give a statement, I said. I've already started writing it. Rosa opened a folder and slid it across. Inside were her own notes, dated the week of Nora's birth. Time of admission logged. Support person absent at delivery and for approximately 21 hours postpartum. Patient attempted repeated contact with husband via phone during active labor. Husband arrived after delivery. Patient appeared physically exhausted but consistently attentive and responsive to infant's needs throughout observed period. No concerns noted regarding maternal bonding or ability to follow medical guidance. I read the last line twice. No concerns noted. 3 ordinary words. And after months of Nathaniel turning my exhaustion into a legal liability, they felt like a window thrown open in a room I'd forgotten had air in it. Rosa watched my face. He came in with flowers and a story. To me, he said traffic. I looked up. He told you he was stuck in traffic? At nearly midnight, after you'd delivered in the early evening. I closed my eyes. Not because the lie surprised me. I had run out of the capacity to be surprised by his lies months ago, but because there were now so many of them stacked on top of each other that I could no longer grieve each one individually. They had become a single, enormous shape rather than a series of specific wounds. He also asked me something the next morning, Rosa continued, whether postpartum anxiety would affect custody determinations. My eyes opened. When? The morning after. You were asleep. Nora was in her bassinet. He came to the nurse's station and asked how medical records typically describe postpartum emotional episodes. A chill moved down my spine. Nora had been less than 24 hours old and Nathaniel had already been thinking legally. Not about diapers, not about my stitches, not about how to properly support his own daughter's neck while holding her for the first time. About custody. About the paper trail he might someday need. The exact instinct, it turned out, that Diane had spent months teaching me to use against him instead. Rosa's lips pressed together. I've delivered a lot of babies with a lot of different kinds of fathers in the room. Most of them are scared and useless in a normal, forgivable way. Your husband was something else. He was rehearsing. 6 weeks before the final hearing, the court appointed a guardian ad litem named Patricia Nolan to evaluate both households and file an independent recommendation. Diane had warned me this was coming and had also warned me, in the same breath, not to treat it as a performance. She's seen every version of staged domestic bliss you can imagine, Diane said. Board books arranged by color, fresh flowers on a table nobody eats at. She's not fooled by any of it. Just live your actual life the day she comes, and let the actual life speak for itself. So when Patricia Nolan arrived at my father's house on a Tuesday afternoon with a clipboard and a calm, unreadable expression, she found exactly what existed there without alteration. A nursery my father had helped me paint pale green over a weekend, a bookshelf half filled with board books that had visible teeth marks in at least 4 of them, a diaper genie that needed emptying, and Nora herself, mid-tantrum over a dropped teething ring, red-faced and furious in the specific operatic way only a 5-month-old can manage. I didn't rush to compose the scene into something more presentable. I picked Nora up, retrieved the teething ring from under the couch, wiped it down, and handed it back to her, while she hiccuped through the last of her outrage, and I kept talking to Patricia Nolan the entire time as though this were simply what an afternoon looked like, because it was. She's teething, I said. Everything before 3 o'clock is a negotiation right now. Patricia smiled slightly and made a note I couldn't see. She stayed for 90 minutes, watched my father read to Nora in the study, watched me manage a diaper change, a bottle, and a fussy nap transition without asking for help, and without pretending it was effortless either. She asked about my sleep schedule, my support system, my plans for childcare once I returned to work. She asked about Nathaniel's visitation history since the separation. I answered plainly without embellishment, because embellishment, Diane had told me, is the first thing a trained evaluator learns to smell. Her visit to Nathaniel's house, I learned much later through the filed report, had gone differently. The nursery there had been freshly staged the week prior. New curtains, a rocking chair still wearing its delivery tag tucked behind one cushion, a shelf of books arranged by height rather than by any evidence of use. Vivian had been present for the entire visit, which Patricia's report noted without editorializing, though the note itself did plenty of editorializing on its own. Nathaniel, when asked to demonstrate a diaper change for observational purposes, a standard request apparently in these evaluations, had needed to ask Vivian for help twice. The report, when it was finally filed, ran 14 pages. I read it in Diane's office with my hands folded in my lap so she wouldn't see them shaking. The conclusion, when I finally reached it, was 2 sentences long. The minor child has an established primary attachment to the mother, who has demonstrated consistent, competent, and independent caregiving throughout the child's life. The guardian ad litem recommends the mother be designated primary physical custodian, with the father granted structured, supervised visitation pending demonstrated engagement with parenting resources. I read it 3 times before the words settled into something I could actually feel instead of just understand. 2 weeks after that, my mother-in-law, Constance Cross, requested a meeting through Diane, asking out of insecurity. She was asking out of curiosity about the mechanics, as though it were simply a system she intended to learn and eventually operate herself. I said nothing. There was nothing generous to say, and I'd stopped manufacturing generosity I didn't actually feel. "I'd like to see Nora," Constance said, "supervised on whatever terms you require. I understand I have no right to ask for more than that, and I won't." I allowed it, eventually, on exactly those terms. Supervised visits, scheduled around Nora's routine rather than Constance's convenience. No unaccompanied time until trust had been rebuilt through actual behavior rather than tea-room apologies. The first time Constance saw Nora after the guardian ad litem's report was filed, she cried quietly into a cloth napkin, and I watched without softening too quickly, because tears, I had learned, could be grief. They could also be negotiation. Sometimes a person could offer you both at once and mean every part of it. When the recess ended and Judge Faircloth called the room back to order, Diane rose and buttoned her jacket with none of Gregory Voss's theater, just the quiet efficiency of someone who had never needed an audience to know she was good at her job. "Your Honor, we'd like to address the video just presented, along with several other pieces of evidence Mr. Voss's opening did not include." Judge Faircloth nodded. "Proceed." "That video," Diane said, "was recorded by Mr. Cross without Miss Ashford's knowledge or consent during an episode of infant colic, at a moment when Miss Ashford had specifically asked him to hold their daughter for 10 minutes so she could shower. Instead, he filmed her. She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. We'd like to submit the full, unedited footage, which Mr. Voss's excerpt conveniently truncated before the portion where Ms. Ashford asks Mr. Cross, 4 separate times, to put down the phone and help her." Gregory Voss half rose. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is editorializing." "Overruled. I'd like to see the full footage myself, actually, given the discrepancy," Judge Faircloth said, adjusting her glasses. The full video played. It ran 90 additional seconds beyond what Voss had shown, 90 seconds in which my voice, thin and cracking, asked Nathaniel 4 times to help me, and in which his voice, flat and unmoved, replied each time with some version of "You need to see yourself right now. This is important." The video ended with him walking away, phone still raised, while Nora's crying continued behind him. The courtroom was very quiet when it finished. "Your Honor," Diane continued, "we'd also like to submit 12 months of financial records prepared by a certified forensic accountant, demonstrating that over $90,000 in marital funds were diverted, without Ms. Ashford's knowledge, into accounts benefiting Ms. Marsh, during the period in which Mr. Cross now claims Ms. Ashford exhibited financial instability." Priyanka Ose was called to the stand. She walked through the transfers methodically, date by date, without a hint of drama, which somehow made the numbers land harder than any amount of outrage could have. Rent payments on an apartment Nathaniel never disclosed to me. A jewelry purchase matched to a since-deleted social media post. A leased vehicle registered under a name that traced back to Vivian's cousin, payments made automatically from an account with my name still legally attached to it. Then Rosa took the stand, calm in her scrubs even in a suit borrowed for the occasion, and read her statement about the night of Nora's birth, about the flowers and the lie about traffic, about the question Nathaniel had asked at the nurse's station less than a day after his daughter existed, whether postpartum anxiety would affect custody determinations. Gregory Voss objected twice during her testimony and was overruled both times. Then Diane called Nathaniel to the stand for cross-examination. He walked up in the same charcoal suit, adjusting his cuffs, and I watched him settle into the chair with the particular confidence of a man who has never once been questioned by someone he couldn't eventually charm. "Mr. Cross," Diane began, "what is your daughter's pediatrician's name?" A pause, just slightly too long. "Doctor. I believe it's Dr. Alvarez." "It's Dr. Whitfield," Diane said. Dr. Alvarez was her pediatrician for the first 2 weeks of her life, before Ms. Ashford switched practices in April. "Were you aware of that switch?" "I've been very busy with—" "Yes or no, Mr. Cross?" "No." "What formula brand does your daughter currently use?" Another pause. "I'd have to check my notes." "You don't have notes with you, Mr. Cross. What size diapers does she wear?" "This is harassment," he said, glancing toward Voss, who did not intervene, because there was nothing in the rules of evidence that would have helped him. "It's a question about the child you are petitioning to take primary custody of," Diane said evenly. "I'll move on. Can you explain the $91,400 transferred from your joint account into accounts associated with Ms. Marsh over the past 14 months? Those were business-related expenses. Ms. Ose's report identifies specific rent payments on a residential unit at 214 Newberry Street. Is that a business expense?" Silence. "Mr. Cross, were you at the Excelsior Hotel downtown on the night of March 18th, between the hours of 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. His jaw tightened. "I don't recall the specific date." "Your daughter had a fever of 102 degrees that night. Ms. Ashford called your phone 7 times. Records show your phone connected to the hotel's guest Wi-Fi network at 1:04 a.m. Were you at the Excelsior Hotel that night?" The silence stretched long enough that Judge Faircloth looked up from her notes. "Yes," he finally said, quiet. "With Ms. Marsh?" "Yes." "While your infant daughter had a fever and your wife was calling you 7 times?" "I didn't know about the fever until later." "You didn't answer your phone 7 times to find out," Diane said, not as a question. She let the silence do the rest of the work, then moved on before the room had fully recovered from it. "One final question, Mr. Cross. In your opening statement, your counsel described Miss Ashford's text messages during the newborn period as evidence of instability. Can you read this message to the court?" She handed him a printed page. He read it, his voice noticeably quieter than it had been minutes before. "I can't do this alone anymore. Please pick up. She has a fever and I'm scared. I haven't slept in 2 days. I need help." Where were you when Ms. Ashford sent that message? He didn't answer. You were at the Excelsior Hotel, weren't you? The same night. Objection, Voss said weakly. Asked and answered. Withdrawn, Diane said. Nothing further, Your Honor. Nathaniel stepped down from the stand and returned to his seat without looking at me. For the first time all morning, Vivian did not reach for his sleeve. Gregory Voss called Vivian to the stand next, presumably as the character witness he'd promised the hallway earlier that morning, though I suspected even he understood by then that the strategy had curdled somewhere between his opening statement and Nathaniel's unraveling on cross. She sat straight-backed, hands folded, the cream dress somehow less impressive under courtroom fluorescence than it had been in the hallway that morning. Voss asked her gentle, guiding questions about her relationship with Nathaniel, about her concern for Nora's well-being, about the stable, loving environment she claimed to be building alongside him. Vivian answered smoothly, her voice pitched exactly toward warmth, and for a moment I understood, watching her, how she had managed to convince herself she was the reasonable one in all of this. Then Diane rose for cross-examination. Ms. Marsh, do you recall a conversation with Ms. Ashford at a coffee shop in the South End on May 14th? Vivian's composure flickered just slightly. I recall meeting with her, yes. Do you recall telling her that Mr. Cross has people who will testify that she's unstable? I don't recall the specific wording. Your Honor, we'd like to enter into evidence an audio recording of that conversation, made legally in a public establishment, previously disclosed to opposing counsel during discovery. Voss objected on grounds of relevance and was overruled, given that the witness's own credibility as a proposed character witness was directly at issue. The recording played. Vivian's voice filled the courtroom, tinny through the speaker but unmistakably hers. I mean someone who can help raise her without turning every day into a crisis. Someone calm, presentable. Someone who isn't sobbing on the floor holding an infant. And later, he has people who will testify that you're unstable. I watched Judge Faircloth's expression shift almost imperceptibly as the recording played. Not toward outrage exactly, but toward the specific weary recognition of someone who has heard this particular genre of self-incrimination many times before, and is never quite tired of watching it land. When the recording ended, Diane asked one more question. Ms. Marsh, were you aware, at the time of that conversation, that Mr. Cross was still legally married to Ms. Ashford when you began your relationship with him? Vivian's jaw tightened. I was told the marriage was already over. By whom? By Nathaniel. And do you believe that now? Objection, Voss said. Calls for speculation about her own state of mind, which is arguably fair, but I'll allow it, Judge Faircloth said, not looking up. I'm curious too. Vivian's mouth opened, then closed. I don't know what I believe anymore, she finally said quietly, and for one strange second I felt something that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't nothing either. Then she straightened her shoulders and the moment passed. Nothing further, Diane said. Then it was my turn. I handed Nora to my father, who was seated in the gallery behind me, and walked to the stand with my heart working harder than I let my face show. Diane's questions were plain, almost gentle, designed less to perform outrage than to simply let the last 5 months speak in my own voice, rather than through documents alone. Ms. Ashford, can you describe a typical day of caring for Nora? I did. The 2 a.m. feeding, the appointments, the folder I kept of every medical record because no one else was keeping one, the nights my father sat up with me when Nora had a rough stretch of teething, the work I'd started doing part-time from home now that I had childcare support and a schedule that finally belonged to me instead of to someone else's convenience. Why did you leave the marital home? Because I found out my husband had been unfaithful for the majority of my pregnancy and the first months of our daughter's life, and because I discovered he had been diverting shared funds toward that relationship while telling me we needed to economize. Are you seeking to prevent Mr. Cross from having a relationship with his daughter? No, I said, and meant it fully, which surprised even me a little sitting there. I'm seeking a custody arrangement that reflects who has actually done the work of raising her, and I'm asking the court to require that his involvement be genuine rather than staged for the purposes of a hearing. Gregory Voss's cross-examination was brief and largely unsuccessful, built mostly around reframing my exhaustion during the newborn period as evidence of instability, a strategy that had already collapsed once that morning and did not improve with a second attempt. "Isn't it true," he asked, "that you sent your husband messages describing yourself as unable to cope?" "I sent messages asking my daughter's father to help me care for her. I don't consider asking for help evidence of instability. I consider it evidence that I understood correctly what a partnership was supposed to look like." He had no good follow-up to that, and didn't pretend otherwise for long. Closing arguments took most of the remaining afternoon. Voss's closing was noticeably thinner than his opening had been, stripped of the confident staging from that morning, leaning instead on generalized language about co-parenting in good faith that sounded, by that point, like exactly the empty phrase it was. Diane's closing was quiet and precise, walking the judge back through the timeline one final time, not with anger, but with the simple cumulative weight of documented fact laid end to end. "Your Honor," she said, closing her folder, "this case was never actually complicated. It only looked complicated because one party spent considerable resources trying to make it look that way. Nora Elizabeth Cross has one parent who has been present for every single day of her life, and one parent who has been present primarily for the days a camera or a courtroom happen to be watching. We're asking the court to recognize the difference because Nora, eventually, will notice it too." Judge Faircloth thanked both counsel and announced she would issue her ruling within 5 business days rather than from the bench that afternoon, which Diane told me afterward was entirely normal in a case with this much documentary evidence to properly weigh, and not, as I'd briefly feared, a sign of any lingering uncertainty. The 5 days that followed were the longest of my life since the thunderstorm night Nora was born. I didn't sleep well during those 5 days, though it wasn't the same kind of sleeplessness I'd known during the newborn months. That exhaustion had been about survival. This one was about waiting for a verdict I already believed, somewhere underneath the fear that I had earned, which made the fear itself feel almost embarrassing, like doubting a math problem you'd checked 7 times and gotten right every time. My father filled the days with a steadiness I hadn't expected and probably didn't deserve yet, given how recently I'd rebuilt the bridge between us. He took Nora for long stretches so I could work, or sleep, or simply sit in the study doing nothing at all, which turned out to be its own kind of necessary labor after 5 months of never once being permitted to do nothing. He didn't ask me how I was doing more than once a day, which I appreciated more than any amount of hovering would have. On the 3rd day, I went back to the coffee shop in the South End, not to relive anything exactly, but because Diane had mentioned, almost in passing, that Vivian had been let go from her position at the investment firm where she and Nathaniel had originally met, once the internal compliance office caught wind of the shell account transfers during an unrelated audit triggered, ironically, by our own forensic accountant's subpoenaed records. I hadn't gone looking for that outcome. It had simply arrived, the way consequences sometimes do, slightly delayed and entirely deserved. I sat by the same window, alone this time, and ordered a coffee. I actually drank, and thought about how strange it was that a building could hold both the worst conversation of your year and, 6 weeks later, a genuinely peaceful hour by yourself with nothing more complicated to manage than a cooling cup of coffee. On the 5th day, Diane called at 9:14 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I have apparently become a person who checks the clock at every significant moment in my life now, a habit Nathaniel accidentally trained into me and that I intend to keep, since it has turned out to be useful, rather than merely anxious. "The ruling's in," Diane said. "Do you want me to read it to you over the phone? Or do you want to come in?" "Read it to me," I said. "I don't think I can drive right now either way." She read it slowly, and I made her repeat the second paragraph twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to hear it a second time before I let myself fully believe it. The court finds that the minor child, Nora Elizabeth Cross, has an established, secure primary attachment to the mother, Reagan Ashford, who has served as the child's consistent primary caregiver since birth. The court further finds credible evidence that the petitioner engaged in a pattern of financial concealment and misrepresentation materially relevant to these proceedings. Primary physical custody is awarded to the mother. The father is granted supervised visitation, to transition to unsupervised visitation contingent upon completion of a court-approved parenting education program and demonstrated consistent engagement over a minimum 6-month period. The petitioner is ordered to reimburse the marital estate in the amount of $91,400 to be offset against future support obligations. I sat on the floor of my father's study, phone pressed to my ear, and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to since the night Nora was born. Not from grief this time, but from the strange, disorienting relief of finally being believed by someone whose belief actually carried legal weight. "You did the hard part months ago," Diane said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "The law just finally caught up to what was already true." There was one more formal appearance required before the ruling became final, a brief hearing to confirm the terms of the parenting plan and the reimbursement schedule, which took less than 20 minutes and felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had led to it. Nathaniel sat beside Gregory Voss, looking smaller than he had that first morning, his suit somehow less impressive on a body that seemed to have shrunk slightly around whatever certainty he'd walked in with 5 months earlier. Something in me expected the moment to feel triumphant. It didn't, exactly. I didn't want Nathaniel eternally humiliated. I didn't want him destroyed in some cinematic collapse witnessed by strangers. I wanted something colder and more permanent than that. I wanted him to simply stop mattering to my sense of my own worth, and somewhere over the past 5 months, without my fully noticing the transition, that was exactly what had happened. At the end of the hallway, my father appeared with Nora in his arms. She was awake, gnawing thoughtfully on her own fist, eyes wide and serious in the particular way she'd started studying rooms lately, as though cataloging them for later reference. I walked toward her, and the moment I took her into my arms, the noise of the courthouse seemed to recede into something distant and unimportant. "Hi, baby girl," I whispered into her hair. "We're going home?" Home. For months, that word had meant an apartment where I cried quietly so Nathaniel could sleep undisturbed. A nursery he only entered when he suspected he was being observed. A kitchen where I'd once found lipstick on a wine glass and tried, for far too long, to convince myself that love simply didn't leave stains like that. Now home meant something else entirely. A room in my father's house for a while, a crib positioned by a window that got good morning light, a signed court order tucked into a binder, and a future that was no longer built, day to day, around anyone else's moods. Outside the courthouse, the air was cold enough to sting. There were no reporters, no public spectacle, no crowd gathered to applaud. Life rarely wraps its victories in music the way you imagine it will. People hurried past with coffee cups and briefcases and parking tickets and their own private disasters, entirely uninterested in mine. Nathaniel followed me down the steps. "Reagan." My father turned, but I touched his arm. "It's all right." I turned to face him. He stood 2 steps above me, as if even now his body sought out whatever small advantage of height it could still claim. "I don't want to lose my daughter," he said, "then learn how to be her father." His face faltered. "I can. I will. But you don't have to shut me out." "I'm not shutting you out. The court gave you a path. Supervised, but real, if you actually walk it." He swallowed. "And us?" The question hung there in the winter air longer than it deserved to. Us. There had been an us once. I wasn't going to pretend there hadn't been. There had been early mornings with pancakes and bad coffee, barefoot weekend trips upstate, nights early in our marriage when he'd held my hand, and I had genuinely believed being chosen by someone meant being safe with them. But memory isn't a contract. Love doesn't erase harm simply because the love happened to arrive first. "There's no us anymore," I said. His eyes shone suddenly, and for the first time I found myself wondering whether he truly hadn't believed it until that exact second, standing on those steps, watching me walk away with something he could no longer legally claim to own. "I got confused," he said. I shook my head. "No. You made choices." Vivian came out behind him a moment later, her mascara smudged, whatever gloss she'd started the day with long gone. She looked at Nathaniel, then at me, then at Nora. For a second her gaze softened into something I couldn't fully name. Regret, maybe. Envy, possibly. Or maybe she was already calculating her next move, the way she always seemed to be. I found, standing there, that I genuinely didn't care which it was. Nathaniel reached toward me, not quite touching. I took a step back. The whole ending of us was contained in that one small movement, and he understood it immediately. His hand fell back to his side. My father's car waited at the curb. Diane handed me the binder with the signed order inside it. My father opened the back door, then stepped aside to let me get in first. Not guiding me, not managing the moment, just giving me the space to choose my own next step, which was, in the end, exactly what he'd been trying to offer me all along, in every form he knew how to offer it. Before I sat down, I looked back at the courthouse one final time. I had walked in that morning with my daughter while 2 people assumed I'd come alone. I was walking out with my daughter, with my name fully my own again, with my evidence vindicated, with my father standing behind me, and with myself, finally, entirely returned to my own keeping. 3 months after the ruling, the preliminary order became the basis for a permanent custody agreement, finalized with only minor adjustments once Nathaniel's parenting education program was underway. He attended the required classes, a 12-week course run out of a community center in Cambridge, meant for parents whose custody arrangements had been shaped, in whole or in part, by demonstrated deficits in caregiving. Diane told me, with something close to dry amusement, that he'd initially tried to get the requirement waived on the grounds that he could simply hire a consultant to bring him up to speed. The judge had not been receptive to that framing. He attended the supervised visits that followed, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with what looked, from a careful distance, like genuine effort. He learned Nora's formula brand eventually, though by the time he did, it no longer mattered as a weapon in a courtroom, only as an ordinary fact a father is supposed to know. He learned her nap schedule because a court monitor was documenting whether he could follow it, and there was something almost sad about watching a man finally do the bare minimum of fatherhood only because someone with actual authority was standing nearby to notice if he didn't. I won't pretend the visits were uniformly difficult to witness. There were moments, Nora laughing at something ridiculous he did with a set of stacking cups, Nathaniel visibly startled by how much stronger her grip had gotten in 3 months, that looked, from where I sat in the observation area, like the beginning of something that might eventually resemble real fatherhood, assuming he kept choosing it once no one was required to keep score. The financial discovery process, meanwhile, forced a full reimbursement of the diverted marital funds, structured as an offset against his future child support obligations over 18 months. His investment firm didn't collapse. Men like Nathaniel rarely lose their careers over private failures, only over public ones expensive enough to embarrass a board of directors. But his reputation within it wasn't left entirely intact either. Word travels in small industries, quietly but reliably, and I heard, secondhand, that two colleagues who'd once considered him a rising partner candidate had started keeping a more careful distance. Men like Nathaniel fear scandal considerably less than they fear accountability, I came to understand. Scandal, given enough time, gets forgotten by everyone except the person who lived through it. Accountability creates a paper trail that follows you into rooms you didn't expect it to reach. Gregory Voss sent one final, oddly gracious note through Diane's office after the case closed. A brief acknowledgement that the evidence had been more thoroughly assembled than is typical in matters of this kind, which Diane read to me over the phone with visible satisfaction. The professional equivalent, she said, of an opposing counsel tipping his hat on the way out the door. Vivian left the investment firm before spring, officially for new opportunities, a phrase that fools almost no one in an industry small enough to know exactly what it usually means. I heard, through the same second-hand channels that carry most of this kind of news, that she blamed Nathaniel for the fallout, for the audit, for the reputational damage, for the general unraveling of a life she'd apparently expected to simply upgrade rather than complicate. I believed that part easily enough. I also believed, with equal ease, that she blamed me. 6 weeks after the final hearing, at close to midnight, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "As one woman to another." I opened it out of a kind of morbid curiosity I'm not particularly proud of, read the first 2 lines, and then closed it without finishing. As one woman to another, I think you should know what he's really like, now that I've seen it firsthand. I think you deserve to hear. I didn't need to hear it. I had lived it for 3 years before Vivian ever met him, in rooms she'd never once stood in, during nights she'd never once had to survive alone with a newborn and an unanswered phone. As one woman to another hadn't mattered to her when I was bleeding in a hospital bed 19 hours into a labor she'd known nothing about, or pretended to know nothing about, at the time. It didn't suddenly start mattering to me now, 6 weeks after a courtroom had confirmed everything I'd already known long before she thought to warn me about it. I deleted the email without responding. Some doors, once you've finally finished closing them, aren't worth the effort of reopening even a crack, even out of curiosity, even at midnight when the house is quiet and a small, tired part of you wonders what she actually wrote in the paragraphs you never read. I heard, much later, secondhand again, that she'd moved to Chicago. I hope, in the specific, complicated way you can hope something for a person you don't particularly like, that she eventually finds whatever she was actually looking for in all of this, rather than another version of the same arrangement with someone else's husband. It wasn't my job to hope harder than that on her behalf, and I'd stopped, months earlier, doing jobs that weren't mine. Constance requested visits through a scheduling app Diane had set up specifically for this purpose, using language so consistently polite it practically creaked under its own restraint every single time. I allowed the supervised grandmother visits only when they didn't disrupt Nora's routine, which meant Constance learned, slowly and without much grace at first, to work around a schedule instead of expecting the schedule to work around her. A lesson I suspected she'd never once had to learn in her own adult life until that point. She brought wooden toys, mostly, the kind sold in boutique shops with names like Little Acorn and Grow Wild, and once brought a hand-knitted sweater in a size Nora had already outgrown by the time it arrived, which Constance received the news of with a visible, almost touching disappointment before asking, quietly, what size to buy next time. It was a small moment, but it told me something real about how genuinely she was trying, in whatever limited way 3 decades of a particular kind of upbringing had left available to her. Priya, my closest friend from business school, called the week after the ruling became final news among the small circle of people who'd known both Nathaniel and me back when we were still, technically, a happy couple in other people's estimation. "I should have pushed harder," she said, when I finally picked up after 4 missed calls I'd let go to voicemail out of a lingering, irrational embarrassment. "I noticed things. I told myself it wasn't my place. You reached out more than you probably remember," I said, because it was true, and because I'd spent enough months being unfairly harsh toward myself that I no longer had much appetite left for being unfairly harsh toward the people who actually deserved a second look. I was the one who stopped answering. We met for lunch 2 weeks later, and it felt, for the first hour, slightly strange in the way reunions do after a long silence neither person fully chose, testing which topics were still safe, which jokes still landed the same way they used to. By the second hour, something had loosened, and I found myself laughing at something genuinely funny for what felt like the first time in over a year. The specific, full-bodied laugh that arrives only when you've stopped monitoring yourself for someone else's comfort. I went back to work part-time in late spring, at a smaller advisory firm run by a woman named Dana Whitcomb, who had coincidentally gone through a similarly difficult divorce a decade earlier and built her entire hiring philosophy around giving competent people the flexibility their actual lives required, rather than the flexibility their resumes suggested they should need. It wasn't the career trajectory I'd once imagined for myself in my 20s, ambitious and unencumbered, but it was mine, chosen deliberately, on a schedule that centered Nora rather than apologizing for her existence, which turned out to matter more to me than the trajectory itself ever had. Nora's first birthday arrived in early autumn. I planned it small and specific. My father, Priya, Rosa, who'd become, unexpectedly, a genuine friend rather than simply a witness from a difficult chapter. Dana from the office, and Constance, supervised as always but present, watching from a careful distance as Nora smashed a small vanilla cake with both hands and shrieked with a delight that had nothing at all to do with any of the adults' complicated histories with each other. Nathaniel attended for 1 supervised hour, arriving with a wrapped gift and a subdued, careful version of himself I hadn't seen before. Quieter, less performative, as though some part of him had finally understood, 12 months in, that there was no longer an audience left in the room who required convincing. He sang along to the birthday song a beat behind everyone else, and when Nora reached for him afterward, uncertain but curious, he picked her up carefully, the way you hold something you've only recently been trusted with again. I watched from across the room, cake knife still in my hand, and felt something that wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but wasn't quite its opposite either. Just a kind of settled, unbothered neutrality, the particular peace of watching someone finally do the small correct thing at the small correct moment. 3 years too late for it to change anything between us, but not too late, I hoped, for it to still mean something to her. My father and I did not magically become perfect once the case was settled and the immediate crisis had passed. We argued in the ordinary, almost comforting way families argue once the real danger has receded, about the thermostat setting he insisted on keeping at 66 degrees year-round, about the volume on the baby monitor, about whether Nora needed to wear socks indoors during a New England spring that couldn't decide what season it wanted to be. He bought too many wooden toys, echoing Constance's instincts in a way neither of them would have appreciated being told about. I informed him we weren't raising Nora for a catalog spread. He countered that plastic toys made sounds like corporate training videos, a phrase so specific and strange that I laughed for a full minute before I could formulate a rebuttal. But slowly, carefully, Without either of us announcing the process out loud, we were relearning each other. Not as the father and daughter we'd been before Nathaniel, exactly, but as two adults who'd both survived something and were choosing, deliberately, to remain in each other's lives regardless of what it cost either of us in pride. One evening in late May, after Nora was finally asleep, I found my father in the library beside the old piano that had sat, cover closed, against the far wall for as long as I could remember. My mother had played it years ago, before she passed when I was 19, and after that, my father had stopped. Entirely. The way people sometimes stop doing the things that most remind them of a specific loss. The cream-colored cover was open. "You opened it," I said. "You used to play before," he said, "when you were upset." "I played badly when I was upset. I always rushed the ending." He smiled faintly and sat down on the bench, touching a single key gently, not quite pressing it hard enough to make a full sound. "I was thinking about what you said to me, after the wedding rehearsal, about your own name." "I know. You meant it." "I did. I'm still trying to mean it correctly, all these years later." "I know you are." He looked toward the stairs, where Nora slept in the room that had once, decades earlier, been mine. "You're a good mother," he said, and the phrase landed without any warning at all, the way the truest things usually do. I had to turn away because my eyes filled too fast to hide it. "Thank you. You were one before the court date, too," he added quietly. "I want you to know that I know that." That was the part I'd actually needed, more than the ruling itself, more than the financial reimbursement, more than any single piece of evidence Priyanka Ose had ever traced through a spreadsheet. Not that I was a good mother now, in the present tense, once a judge had confirmed it on paper. That I had already been one, fully, before anyone with any authority had required me to prove it to a room full of strangers. He played a few notes after that. Badly, rushed at the ending, exactly the way I remembered doing it myself as a teenager. And neither of us mentioned how much it sounded in that specific, unpolished way, like something being carefully, deliberately relearned, rather than simply remembered. In June, I moved into a small house 10 minutes from my father. Not because I had to leave his, not because anything had gone wrong between us, but because I could, finally, choose to, on my own terms and my own timeline, which was a distinction that mattered to me more than the physical distance itself ever would. It had a blue front door, the kind of unfussy cornflower blue that made the whole house look slightly more cheerful than its actual size probably warranted. The kitchen filled with morning light in a way the apartment I'd shared with Nathaniel never had, tucked as it had been on the shaded side of a taller building. The nursery, Nora's room now, properly hers rather than a space Nathaniel entered only when observed, smelled of fresh paint and the specific lavender fabric softener I'd started using, once I no longer had anyone else's preferences to accommodate in the laundry. Mrs. Delgado, my new next-door neighbor, sent over a potted geranium the first week, along with a note that simply read, "Welcome, and if you ever need someone to grab your mail on short notice, I'm home most days." Priya sent a card with a drawing Nora would eventually be old enough to appreciate. Dana from the office visited once and cried, unexpectedly, when Nora laughed at the sight of her dangling earrings, a reaction Dana blamed, laughing through her own tears, entirely on hormones from a pregnancy of her own that wasn't showing yet. Diane sent the final signed decree with a single handwritten line clipped to the top. "You did the hardest part. The law just finally caught up." The first night in the new house, I carried Nora from room to room, narrating each one the way you do when you're really narrating it for yourself, as much as for a baby who understands none of the actual words yet. "This is the kitchen," I told her. "This is where I'm going to burn pancakes on a regular basis and insist it's rustic on purpose." She waved a fist in what I chose to interpret as enthusiastic agreement. This is the living room. We'll put your books here. Not the pretty ones you're not allowed to touch. The ones you're actually allowed to chew on. She hiccuped, which felt like a reasonable response. And this, I said, walking into the nursery, is your room. The crib sat by the window, positioned to catch the early light. A mobile spun slowly above it, not the one I'd assembled alone at midnight while Nathaniel drank champagne across town, but a new one, stars and moons and small wooden birds my father had picked out after losing, cheerfully, an extended argument about whether infants genuinely appreciated craftsmanship or whether that particular concern was simply his own, projected generously onto a 6-month-old. I laid Nora down. She blinked up at me, sleepy and entirely trusting, and I thought about the courthouse hallway, about Vivian's lipstick, about Nathaniel's carefully chosen suit, about my father rising quietly behind me on those steps, about Judge Faircloth's measured voice reading a ruling that had finally, formally caught up to something I'd already known in my own body for months, about the exact sound of my own voice, steady and unhurried, telling Nathaniel there was no us left to salvage. People tend to assume the moment of real victory arrives loud, announced, something you'd recognize instantly from the outside. Mine arrived quiet. It was my daughter falling asleep in a room no one could take from either of us through fear or paperwork or a carefully staged photograph. It was my own phone charging on the nightstand, dark, not lit up with anyone's name demanding my attention. It was a signed court order tucked into a locked drawer, not because I intended to keep living inside the fight that had produced it, but because I had earned the right to keep the proof that I'd survived it intact. I stood by the crib until Nora's breathing settled into something deep and even, then walked to the front door and looked out at the quiet street for a long time before finally closing it for the night. A year after the ruling, I sat down one evening with the intention of writing something for myself, not for Diane's files, not for a future court filing, nothing official at all, just an honest accounting of where things actually stood, because I'd spent so many months organizing evidence for other people's judgment that I wanted, finally, to organize something purely for my own. Nathaniel had completed his parenting program and transitioned, as the order allowed, into unsupervised visitation, first for a few hours on alternating Saturdays, then eventually for full weekend stretches once he'd demonstrated, consistently, month over month, that he could actually manage Nora's routine without a monitor standing nearby to notice if he didn't. I won't pretend this transition happened without real fear on my part. The first weekend I dropped her off without supervision. I sat in my car in his driveway for 11 minutes before I could make myself pull away, and I called Diane twice that first Saturday for reassurance I mostly already possessed, but needed spoken back to me by someone else. He didn't miss a single scheduled pickup that entire year. He learned, eventually and without prompting, to keep a spare set of Nora's favorite pajamas at his own apartment rather than borrowing mine every visit. He started sending photos, unprompted, of small ordinary moments. Nora asleep on his couch, Nora eating something with more of it on her face than in her mouth. Not as evidence for anyone, just as the kind of thing a father sends because he actually wants to share it with the person who'll appreciate it most. I found, to my genuine surprise, that I did appreciate them, in a small, uncomplicated way that had nothing left in it resembling romantic feeling and everything in it resembling simple relief that Nora, at least, might get to have something resembling a real relationship with her father after all, even if it had taken a courtroom to force its beginning. I want to be honest about something. In this private accounting, I wasn't planning to show anyone. I don't think Nathaniel became a fundamentally different person that year. I think he became a person operating, finally, under real consequences for the first time in his adult life, and it turned out that under sufficient, sustained consequence, he was capable of at least the outward behaviors of decent fatherhood. even if I couldn't say with any confidence what was happening underneath them. I decided, somewhere around month 8, that this distinction didn't actually matter very much to my daily life anymore. Nora needed a father who showed up reliably and treated her well when he did. Whether the internal motivation behind that reliability was pure or simply well-managed self-interest was, in the end, a question I no longer needed to answer in order to sleep soundly at night. Vivian, as far as I ever heard, did not resurface in either of our lives again after her move to Chicago. I assume, without any real evidence either way, that she found some new version of the same pattern to repeat elsewhere, because people rarely abandon a strategy that has, at least in the short term, gotten them measurable results, regardless of the eventual collapse those results tend to produce. It genuinely wasn't my responsibility to track the outcome, and I found, with some relief, that I'd stopped being curious enough to try. Constance's supervised visits transitioned slowly into unsupervised ones once trust had accumulated on both sides in small, verifiable increments. A returned phone call here, a canceled visit rescheduled properly there, rather than simply abandoned. She became, in her own careful, formal way, a genuinely present grandmother, the kind who remembered Nora's evolving preferences in food and toys without needing to be reminded twice. My father and I settled, eventually, into a rhythm that felt less like reconciliation and more like simple, ordinary family life. Sunday dinners, unplanned weekday visits when Nora had a fever and I needed an extra set of hands, small arguments about parenting philosophy that no longer carried any real weight behind them because we both trusted, finally, that neither of us was going anywhere, regardless of how any individual disagreement resolved. I read back over everything I'd written that evening and realized, with a small private satisfaction, that the overall shape of the year amounted to something almost boring by the standards of the year that had preceded it. No courtroom drama, no forensic accountants, no recorded confessions in coffee shops. Just an ordinary, unremarkable year of raising a toddler, slowly rebuilding a family that had nearly been erased by someone who mistook love for leverage, and discovering, gradually, that boring, in the specific sense of uneventful and safe, was actually the entire goal I'd been fighting toward the whole time, without quite realizing it in those exact terms. Nora's second birthday fell on a Saturday in early autumn, exactly the kind of crisp, gold-lit New England day that made the whole town look like it was posing for a postcard. I'd planned it bigger than the first, a small backyard gathering at my father's house, string lights already up from a dinner party the week before that no one had bothered taking down, a bounce house Nora was still too small to fully appreciate, but insisted on climbing the ladder of anyway, unassisted, 4 separate times. Nathaniel arrived on time, alone, in a plain gray sweater rather than the kind of suit he used to wear even to weekend errands, as though some part of him had finally learned that presence mattered more than presentation. He'd asked, the week before, through the proper channels, whether it would be all right to bring a small gift and stay for the full party, rather than the single supervised hour that had once been the ceiling of what the court allowed him. Diane had confirmed the arrangement fell well within the current terms, and I'd said yes without much internal debate, which surprised me a little when I noticed how easy the decision had actually been. He spent most of the afternoon on the periphery of things, comfortable in a way I hadn't quite seen from him before, helping Priya's husband manage the grill, catching Nora at the bottom of the bounce house slide twice, sitting cross-legged on the grass at one point so she could climb onto his back and demand, imperiously, to be carried, like a horsey, a request he honored for a solid 10 minutes, despite what must have been considerable discomfort in his knees. Constance arrived with a properly sized sweater this time and cried, briefly and without apology, when Nora blew out both candles on her own before anyone had finished singing. Near the end of the afternoon, Once most of the guests had thinned out, and Nora had fallen into the specific, overstimulated exhaustion that follows any toddler birthday party, Nathaniel found me alone by the drinks table, refilling a pitcher of lemonade no one particularly needed refilled. "Thank you for letting me stay for the whole thing," he said. "She's had a good day. That's what matters." He nodded, quiet for a moment. "I used to think you were exaggerating in the divorce filings, about how absent I actually was those first months. I told myself I remembered it differently." I didn't say anything, mostly because I wasn't sure yet where he was going with it, and some old caution in me still expected a pivot toward blame before the sentence finished. "I don't think that anymore," he said instead. "I watched the footage they played in court more times than I probably should have, afterward, on my own. I don't know how to apologize for something that size in a way that would actually mean anything to you at this point. I'm not going to try to. I just wanted you to know I finally see it the way it actually happened, instead of the way I needed to remember it at the time." It wasn't an apology exactly, or maybe it was the only kind of apology a man like Nathaniel was capable of constructing, an acknowledgement of fact rather than an appeal for forgiveness, offered without any request attached to it for how I was supposed to receive it. "Thank you for saying that," I said, and meant it, in the small, unbothered way you can mean something toward a person you've genuinely stopped needing anything further from. He nodded again, and something in his shoulders relaxed slightly, as though he'd been carrying that particular sentence around for months, waiting for an opening that wouldn't feel like it was asking me for something I didn't owe him. Later that evening, after everyone had gone and Nora was asleep in her own bed at last, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea I'd let go cold without noticing, and thought about how strange it was that the man who had once told a hallway full of strangers that I couldn't survive without him had, eventually, arrived at something almost like honesty, entirely on his own timeline, long after it had stopped being capable of costing me anything either way. I felt mostly a kind of quiet, unspectacular relief. Not for myself, particularly, since I'd already built an entire life independent of whatever growth he did or didn't manage. For Nora, because whatever version of a father he was slowly becoming, however many years too late it had started, was still a version she'd get to have, and that mattered to me now in a way that had nothing left to do with him and everything to do with her. People sometimes asked me, in the months after the case became a settled, ordinary fact of my life rather than an open wound, how I'd known to start saving everything so early. The bank statements, the screenshots, the folder titled Evidence that I'd created at 4 a.m. with shaking hands, months before I consciously understood I would ever need any of it in a courtroom. I never had a fully satisfying answer for them, because the honest one felt too small to explain something that had ended up mattering so much. The truth is that I didn't start saving things because I was strategic. I started saving things because some part of me, quieter and more clear-eyed than the part of me that kept apologizing to Nathaniel for noticing his lies, understood that I would eventually need to prove, to someone, possibly even just to myself, that I hadn't imagined any of it. Gaslighting works, when it works, by making you distrust your own memory more than you distrust the person actively lying to you. The folder was never really about court. It was about giving my own future self permission to believe her own eyes again, on a night when Nathaniel had spent 2 years training me not to. I went back to full-time work the following year, once Nora started at a small daycare center near Dana's office that specialized, unglamorously but effectively, in exactly the kind of steady, unremarkable care a toddler actually needs, rather than the kind that photographs well for a marketing brochure. I was promoted within 18 months, not because the promotion mattered enormously to me in itself, but because Dana had built her firm around a philosophy I found myself repeating quietly to Nora as she grew, that competence and reliability, sustained honestly over time, eventually get recognized by the people worth being recognized by, even if it takes considerably longer than the version of success Nathaniel had once tried to sell me on. I dated, eventually, though not for over a year after the ruling, and not with any particular urgency once I did. The men I met in that first stretch mostly failed a very simple, very early test I'd developed without fully meaning to: how they responded the first time I mentioned, in passing, that I was a single mother by way of a difficult custody case. Some of them leaned in with a performative, slightly theatrical sympathy that felt, uncomfortably, like an audition for a role they thought I wanted them to play. A few, fewer than I expected, simply asked how Nora was doing, genuinely, and let the rest of the conversation happen on its own terms without turning my history into either a red flag or a talking point. I'm not going to pretend this story ends with some tidy romantic conclusion, because it doesn't. Not yet, and possibly not ever in the specific way certain kinds of stories insist it should. What it ends with, instead, is something I've come to think matters considerably more: a woman who rebuilt her own credibility, one documented fact at a time, in a system that initially seemed built to disbelieve her, and who came out the other side of that rebuilding with a version of herself she actually recognized again. Steadier, less apologetic, considerably harder to gaslight, and entirely capable of building a good, full life for her daughter, regardless of whether any particular man ever showed up to co-sign it. Before I close this account, I want to go back to something I skipped over earlier, because I think it matters, and because I suspect other women reading this will recognize the shape of it exactly. The mediation attempt that happened between the temporary hearing and the final trial, the one Diane agreed to only because the court, at that stage, still required both parties to make a documented good faith effort before proceeding to a full contested hearing. We met in a conference room at a family mediation center in Cambridge, a deliberately neutral space with soft chairs and a bowl of hard candy on the side table that nobody touched. The mediator, a soft-spoken man named Arthur Feld, had decades of experience and a manner so carefully even-handed that it occasionally felt, in the moment, almost frustrating, as though the sheer scale of what Nathaniel had done and the ordinary business of my having asked him, repeatedly, to help care for our newborn daughter were simply two competing narratives of roughly equal weight, awaiting his neutral arbitration. Nathaniel arrived with Gregory Voss present, technically against the spirit of the process but within its actual rules, and spent the first 40 minutes presenting a version of our marriage so thoroughly sanitized of his own conduct that I found myself at one point genuinely unsure whether he'd started to believe it himself or was simply performing it with enough conviction that the distinction had stopped mattering to him. "I think," he said at one point, hands folded on the table in a posture I recognized from a dozen investor meetings I'd watched him rehearse in our old bedroom mirror, "that Reagan and I both want what's best for Nora. I think the disagreement is really just about method." Arthur Feld nodded, neutrally, and turned to me. "Ms. Ashford, is that a fair characterization?" "No," I said. "The disagreement is that he had an affair during my pregnancy, diverted marital funds to support it, was absent for the majority of Nora's first 5 months of life, and is now petitioning for primary custody using my own exhaustion, which he directly caused, as evidence against me. That's not a disagreement about method. That's a disagreement about facts. And the facts aren't actually in dispute, because I have them documented." Nathaniel's expression flickered briefly towards something almost like real anger. Not performed this time, but genuine. The specific anger of a man unaccustomed to having his preferred narrative interrupted mid-delivery. "This is exactly the hostility I'm talking about." "It's not hostility," I said. "It's accuracy." Arthur Feld attempted for another hour to find some workable middle ground, A modified schedule, a graduated transition period, language softened enough that both parties could sign something without either fully conceding the underlying facts. Nathaniel's proposed terms, once actually written down, amounted to almost exactly what Gregory Voss would later formalize into the settlement offer. Diane and I rejected outright. Limited support, custody, shifting steadily in his favor, a non-disclosure clause tucked into language about maintaining a positive co-parenting environment. I refused to sign anything at the mediation table that day, and Diane, waiting outside per the process's rules, told me afterward that my refusal was exactly the right call. Even though it meant the case would now proceed to a full contested hearing rather than resolving quietly and privately, the way these things are generally encouraged to resolve whenever possible. Mediation works, she told me, when both parties are negotiating in good faith over genuinely disputed territory. It doesn't work when one party is simply trying to get a documented, court-recognized version of the exact same manipulation he's already been running at home for a year. You were right, not to give him that. I think about that mediation session often, actually, more than I think about most of the actual trial. It was the moment I fully understood that the entire legal process, for all its genuine value in the end, was never going to hand me justice automatically, simply because the facts happened to be on my side. It was going to require me, at every single stage, to keep insisting on the facts myself, out loud, in rooms specifically designed to make disputed truth and comfortable fiction sound like two equally reasonable positions deserving equal weight. Arthur Feld wasn't a bad mediator. He was simply doing a job whose entire structure assumes both parties are arguing in reasonably good faith, and that structure has no real answer for what happens when one party isn't. I left that session more determined than I'd been walking in, not less, which I suspect was the opposite of what Nathaniel and Gregory Voss had actually hoped a failed mediation would accomplish. I haven't yet described the character witnesses Diane called during the trial itself, and I think they deserve their own account. Because in a case built so heavily on financial records and video footage, it would be easy to forget that actual people, standing in a courtroom under oath, were willing to say out loud what they'd personally witnessed. Priya testified first among them, dressed more formally than I'd ever seen her outside of a work presentation, visibly nervous in a way that made me love her more rather than less. Diane asked her to describe our friendship over the years, and Priya, after a shaky first answer, settled into something clear and specific. I watched Reagan slowly stop returning calls over about 2 years, she said. Not because she stopped caring about her friends, because every time she made plans with us, Nathaniel would create some reason it became difficult, or he'd be visibly displeased when she got home, and eventually it was just easier for her, in the moment, to stop trying. I want to be clear that I don't think that was Reagan's failure. I've seen this pattern before, in other friends, with other men, and it always looks the same from the outside, even when the person living it can't see it themselves yet. Gregory Voss, on cross-examination, tried to frame this testimony as evidence that I had, in fact, isolated myself of my own accord, a choice rather than a consequence. Priya didn't take the bait. I don't think choice is the right word for a pattern engineered by someone else's behavior, she said evenly. I think that's the word he'd like used, because it moves the responsibility off of him. Diane also called Dana, my current employer, who spoke to my reliability and competence during the months I'd worked for her. Early on, she noted, while I was still deep in the custody proceedings and functioning, by any reasonable professional standard, at a fully high level despite everything happening outside the office, Rosa's testimony, which I've already described, carried its own particular weight precisely because she had no personal stake in the outcome beyond her professional obligation to describe what she'd actually witnessed on a maternity ward 18 years into a career built on exactly that kind of careful, unbiased observation. Nathaniel's side called two witnesses of their own, a colleague from his firm who described him as a devoted, hands-on father whenever I've seen them together. A characterization that collapsed somewhat under Diane's cross-examination once it became clear the colleague had seen Nathaniel with Nora exactly twice, both times at office holiday events staged well after the separation had already begun. They also called Vivian's roommate from before she moved in with Nathaniel, who offered vague, generalized praise about Nathaniel's character that similarly thinned considerably once Diane asked how well the roommate actually knew the specifics of his marriage, rather than simply the version of it Vivian had described to her secondhand. Watching those two witnesses testify, thin and unconvincing next to the specific lived detail Priya and Rosa and Dana had offered, I understood something about the entire structure of the case that I hadn't fully articulated to myself before that point. The truth, when you actually have it, doesn't need much decoration. It was Nathaniel's side that needed adjectives: devoted, hands-on, stable, structured. Precisely because the underlying facts, examined closely, didn't hold those words up on their own. My side needed almost no adjectives at all. We simply needed dates, documents, and people willing to describe, plainly, what they had personally seen. There's a specific evening I keep returning to, more than any single dramatic moment from the courtroom itself, when I try to explain to myself how thoroughly things eventually changed. It wasn't the ruling. It wasn't the steps outside the courthouse, or the moment Diane read me the verdict over the phone, or even the first night in the house with the blue front door. It was an ordinary Tuesday, almost 2 years after that first morning in the courthouse hallway, when Nora was old enough to walk confidently from room to room on her own and old enough, too, to ask her first real questions about the shape of her family. We were in the kitchen. I was making dinner, something simple, and she was sitting at the small table I'd bought specifically because it was low enough for her to climb into her own chair without help, coloring with the specific, fierce concentration only a 2.5-year-old can bring to a task with no actual stakes attached to it. "Mama," she said, not looking up from her drawing, "why don't you and Daddy live in the same house?" It was the first time she'd asked directly, in those exact words, rather than simply absorbing the arrangement as the only reality she'd ever known. I set down the knife I was using and crouched beside her chair, because I'd promised myself, long before this moment arrived, that I would answer questions like this one honestly, at whatever level of honesty her age could actually hold. "Sometimes," I said, "two people love someone very much, like Daddy and I both love you, but they realize they can't be a good team living in the same house anymore. So they build two houses instead, so they can both keep being your parent in the best way they know how." She considered this with the total, unhurried seriousness she brought to most things at that age. "Is that sad?" "Sometimes it's a little sad," I said. "But it's not sad the way it used to be. It's just how our family looks now. And you get two houses that both love you very much, which is actually pretty lucky, if you think about it." She seemed satisfied enough with that answer to return to her drawing, and I stood back up and went back to the stove. And that was the entire conversation. No tears, no lingering unease, just a 2.5-year-old absorbing a piece of family architecture the same unremarkable way she absorbed everything else at that age, and moving on to the next crayon. I stood at the stove afterward for longer than the recipe strictly required, thinking about how different that exchange would have felt if it had happened during the year the case was actually being fought. How loaded every word would have needed to be. How carefully I would have had to manage my own face to keep from letting Nora see anything she wasn't ready to carry. Instead, it had simply been a normal Tuesday conversation, answered honestly, absorbed easily, forgotten by dinner. That, I think, is what the whole fight had actually been for, in the end. Not the money, though the money mattered, and not even primarily the custody arrangement itself, though that had mattered more than almost anything else in my adult life. It had been for exactly this: the ability to answer my daughter's ordinary questions about her own family with something close to simple, unguarded honesty, instead of the careful, anxious management of someone else's ego that had defined nearly every conversation I'd had for 3 straight years before I finally stopped having them. People think the moment of real victory arrives loud: a gavel, a headline, a crowd gathered outside a courthouse to applaud. Mine had arrived in the end as something considerably quieter and more durable than any single afternoon in front of a judge. It was a 2.5-year-old coloring at a kitchen table, asking a simple question and getting a simple, true answer. It was my own voice, steady, no longer bracing itself for whatever mood might walk through the door next. It was a house with a blue front door that I'd chosen entirely for myself, in a neighborhood I'd chosen entirely for myself, filled with a small, ordinary, unremarkable life that had once seemed, during the worst of it, like something I would never again be permitted to have. That evening, once Nora was asleep, and the kitchen was clean and the whole small house had gone quiet around me, I walked to the front door, the way I'd started doing most nights without quite noticing when the habit had formed, and looked out at the empty street for a long moment before locking it. No Nathaniel in the driveway, waiting to explain himself. No Vivian's reflection in a dark window somewhere down the block. No voice behind me insisting I be realistic, or careful, or grateful for less than I actually deserved. Just my own quiet street, my own locked door, my own daughter asleep down the hall in a room that would always, now, belong to her, without condition. I switched off the porch light, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence in my own home didn't feel anything like the abandonment it used to disguise itself as, all those years ago, in a different house, with a different last name, and a version of myself I'd had to work very hard, very deliberately, and very patiently to finally leave behind for good. It felt, simply and entirely, like peace. If you've made it this far, I want to say one more thing, not as part of the story itself, but as something I wish someone had told me during the year I spent doubting my own memory in my own kitchen. If someone in your life has convinced you that documenting the truth makes you paranoid, obsessive, or unstable, consider, carefully, who benefits most from your silence. It is very rarely the person telling you to stay quiet for your own good. Keep your own records. Trust your own eyes. The truth, when you actually have it organized, rarely needs to raise its voice to be believed. I don't tell this story because I want anyone's pity, and I don't tell it because I think my situation was uniquely dramatic compared to what so many other women live through quietly, without ever having a courtroom validate any of it on paper. I tell it because the year I spent believing I had no options left was also, without my realizing it at the time, the year I was quietly building every single one of them, one saved email and one printed statement at a time, long before I had any proof that any of it would ever matter to anyone but me. If you're in the middle of your own version of that year right now, exhausted, unsure whether anyone will ever believe what you already know to be true, I hope some part of this reaches you at the right moment. Keep the folder. Name it honestly. You are allowed to trust yourself again on your own timeline, and you are allowed to build the proof in private for as long as you need to, before you ever have to show it to anyone else at all. And if, right now, you're standing in a hallway somewhere, holding a child, letting someone believe you came alone, you don't have to explain that to anyone either. Not yet. Let them believe whatever version of you makes them careless. You'll know exactly when it's time to walk through the doors and let the rest of the room find out what you actually brought with you. I still keep that binder in a locked drawer, even now, years later. Not because I'm still fighting the case it was built for. That case is long over and closed, and finally, mercifully, boring to think about. I keep it because it was the first proof I ever assembled that my own account of my own life was accurate, and some part of me still likes knowing it's there, filed and complete, in case I ever need to remind myself again of exactly how much I was capable of building, quietly, in the dark, long before anyone else believed a word of it.